In today's video, I'm going to restore this toolbox that I picked up at an estate sale. It's in good shape overall. There was one small hole in the side, but otherwise it was pretty sound. So I'm not able to tell if this light gray on top is the original color or if it was this green color, or if and that's just a primer or something else. But if it was green and someone painted it gray, they did not do the best job. So I did have a few old tools that were in there. Some I'll keep and some I'll just get rid of. So you can see, like, these shears and the chisels I like, the nail punches. And inside overall, it was just a little bit of rust on the bottom, but just flaky paint. And I originally thought it was going to be a really easy job because the paint seemed to flake off really easily, but that was certainly not going to be the case. You'll see later. First step was taking off the hardware, which it did not go well. This one screw I'm taking out here is just a spare screw. Apparently it was holding nothing in place on the inside. So I ended up leaving that hole there because I did have to use this screw for one of the other ones that I drilled out. So you can see here some of the screws, they weren't rusted necessarily because these are brass screws, but they weren't coming out for anything for me. So I ended up just breaking out the Dremel and sawed off a good bit of the bolts and the nuts, and that took a while. And as a reminder, the metal gets really hot when you try to cut into it. It's kind of dumb to pick it up barehanded. So the other ones I ended up using just a drill bit. After this first one, I ended up doing a better job of maintaining it. So I kept this in real time just to show about how long it took to drill out each one. And since they're brass screws, they didn't take quite as long as old stainless steel screws might have. And once I got everything apart, went to the wire wheel and scraped off a little bit of the paint on some of the pieces as I could. And here you go, you can see first go round. Then after I took the wire wheel to the pieces, I let them soak in some evapor-rust to make sure I got any of the internal rust, the rust that's in the crevices and other pieces that I just couldn't get necessarily. And here you can see the file that I cleaned up in the meantime while I was waiting on the evapor-rust. That and the nail files, you can see where those cleaned up pretty well too. They were taken out of the evapor-rust before these hinges were. So then after I took them out of here, I washed off the evapor-rust and then took them back to the wire wheel and scraped them one more time. And then this magnet was randomly in the toolbox, and I'm actually going to use it to help get pieces out of evapor-rust that I can't see in the future. So these pieces are all certainly aluminum. I couldn't tell. At one time they might have been coated. On the back of one or two of them it looked like they were coated as brass or coated as copper, bronze, something else. So even though I wore gloves, I pretty much ate through the tips of the gloves, as you can see here, and I only had to use one Band-Aid after using the wire wheel this project, so that's not too bad for me. Since some of the small spots where the wire wheel couldn't get, I just got a little brass small wire wheel, and then when all that was said and done, took some acetone and wiped off any of the oils and grease, and then dried the pieces off individually. So here I started out hoping all this paint was going to be really easy to flake off, so I tried just using a wire brush, and it got rid of some of the really loose stuff, but overall, yeah, it didn't do much of anything for me. So that was kind of a bummer. Then I went outside, took the wire wheel out there, so all that paint I wouldn't have to clean up in the workshop. And that did an okay job, but it still wasn't going to cut it either. So then I tried this, that didn't work. Then I was like, and little tool malfunction there, so I couldn't use that tool either. So I started with 60 grit sandpaper thinking that would be fine on just this sander, but that was going to take forever as well. So then I ended up finding this at a hardware store. It's a really stiff brush. It might look like a sponge, but it's really stiff, and it does a good job of eating up the paint. The problem is I can't get the whole thing. So then I just gave up on all those tools and used 40 grit sandpaper on the belt sander, and that definitely got it. And then it also sanded out any of the little lumps. So got finished, came back inside, sanded or vacuumed everything up, then wiped it down with acetone to get rid of any of the oils, remaining dirt. And from there, started to tape it up, which I thought this toolbox was smaller and trash bags were bigger, but it's kind of a little bit of both. Of trash bags smaller than I thought, and toolbox is bigger. So I just used one trash bag to cover up the little tray that's inside that does not slide. The hinges are actually bolted into that tray, so it's locked in place. So I ended up just taping the edges and spots I did not want to really get any kind of paint on. So for the inside, I used undercoating. I was going to use the truck bed liner again, like I did in the flower box project, but didn't have enough and the store was out of it. So figure undercoating, it'll do about the same idea. It's a little bit of a rubberized texture to it and serves its purpose. And unfortunately, my tape didn't come off as well as I wanted, so didn't get a truly satisfying video of being able to get it off all in one smooth stroke. So this kind of gives you an idea of what that stuff looks like. Then here, I was all ready to go, and the can of primer that I bought was shot. So it rattled, so I thought we were going to be all set, but I could not get anything to happen, so I had to make another trip back to the hardware store. Ended up doing 3 coats of primer to make sure that I had some good coverage on it and the paint would adhere pretty nicely. I did leave one hinge just because where that tray was, those bolts were really tough to get off. And then before I primed, I saw that these little rivets were brass or copper, and I really liked the contrast in it. So I took some acetone and a Q-tip and stripped off the primer, and then also did this later after I painted it. Just one of those little touches that nobody's going to notice, but I like it. And then this, I left this just to show it's kind of a boneheaded move. I should have put the toolbox, flipped it the other way, so I'm hammering down on this part and there's more resistance. I really did nothing by hammering right here. So I ended up realizing that that was a less than ideal move and fixed it. And then the little bit of a gap that was there and then the hole on the left side of your screen, those I filled up with Bondo and then sanded. And I should say that after I primed, I did lightly sand with 320 grit sandpaper on everything, and then realized after the fact I didn't actually hit record on the paint except for this one layer of green paint. So I ended up putting on 3 layers of the spray paint as well, just like I did the primer. And I thought it built up pretty well, but later I scratched the paint and realized it's not quite as deep as I thought it was. Then here, this is just clear coat. I ended up, the magic rule of 3 for this project, ended up putting 3 coats of clear coat on top after the paint had sat for about 3 or 4 days. And watching this video, I can see where I did overlap the different sides a little bit more than I expected. So there are some runs that I noticed, but you can't really see them in video, so I'm not going to tell you about it too much. We'll focus at the big picture, which I think the finished product looks pretty good. And I guess the dogs in the background knew that this guy was going to show up on camera. So here, this part of the video is a little bit longer than I think a lot of you may want, but the goal is to show you in real time how long it took to fix a couple of these screws. So when I was taking them out, it was quite a struggle. So the screwdriver ended up bending, whatever you call this, the groove, not teeth, but bending the screw on here. So I just took a skinny file and got rid of all the sharp edges. So it wasn't perfect, but it certainly made it much better than it was, and that way I can actually use the same screws without having to replace all of them. Clearly the ones that I drilled out and ground out, those were all replaced, and these cleaned up really nicely, you'll see here shortly. Not all of them took this long. This is the worst of the bunch. So that green Scotch-Brite pad, I don't have gray or red, and I only have green, so if you're really particular, each color has a different coarseness to it, but for this project the green worked out fine for me. Also, the little screws I ended up using the drill press. Same principle of putting in there and let the machine spin for you, so you can just hold the Scotch-Brite pad and it'll do all the work for you. Once that was finished, just took some brass cleaner, just a little bit on here, which I didn't realize the camera focused on my shirt versus the screw, which is not ideal. So I did finally get a tripod recently, and this should be the last video where you see me holding the phone or the GoPro as I film. And unfortunately, it didn't zoom until after I moved my hand away, so you couldn't see the true contrast between the before and after. So that one hinge that I left on there, you can tell I struggled. It's not as nice as the other hinge that I was able to take off and polish up, but it's not too bad. I think in hindsight I probably would have put the hinges on the top row first. And then here, this one screw, it happened on two of them. I couldn't get the nut to go in like I wanted, and when I looked, the threads had been compressed just a little bit. So I just took a razor knife to kind of go back in the threads and spread them out just enough so that nut would go on there without fighting me as hard. And same thing here, I probably, if I had known it was going to be a little bit tricky like this, I would have put all the hardware on the lid before I mounted the lid. Some of you may have said that was a no-brainer from the start, but I didn't know. And then where I really screwed up is here. I have a socket set that I'm using to hold the nut in place, the socket and ratchet, and then I ended up, rather than using the socket and ratchet, I was turning the screwdriver, which ended up jumping out of my hand and scratched the toolbox at least 3 times because I don't learn from my mistakes very quickly. And here you can see where that tray, shelf, whatever you want to call it, is screwed into the hinge and the latch, so that way it doesn't slide. But it does give you fits, because what I didn't realize is those 2 latches, one's supposed to go on the right, one's supposed to go on the left, apparently just based on the way this toolbox has been used over the years. But here, the only screws they had left at the store, the final 3 I needed, I ended up having to buy flat head instead of round head, but it works well because there are only 3 and they're only on that one lock piece of it there, so you can't really notice unless I point it out to you. And then off camera I did switch the latches because you'll see what happens here in just a second. So that worked fine, and then here I couldn't get it to go down, and I ended up actually trying to force it so much rather than just stop. you figure when I was putting it together, I probably would have noticed that something was wrong. But I figured it was just paint at first, and that's why I kept going, which was not the best thought process. So I ended up taking these two latches off, switching sides of them, and it works out fine now. Here you can kind of see what I was talking about, of holding the nut on the underside with the ratchet and then screwing it in. But if you just hold the screw with the screwdriver and use the ratchet, it's a lot better. And there I was getting out a little bit of extra brass cleaner that I had in some of those heads. And here, this is just Toolbox liner. It's essentially rubber for the most part, but I did see one person that said in an online forum that if you take a heat gun to the bottom of it, it does kind of adhere a little bit better. But I did not do that. So here you go. Here's a quick before and after. All that paint and everything's painted over, so you had no idea that the screws that were there were actually brass. There's a little file that I briefly cleaned up. So now here's the after. I really like the way it looks. I won't point out too much of my little hiccup of the scratch, but if you look on the right side of the handle, you'll see where my screwdriver got away from me and scratched it. And then there's one more right in front between that latch and this lock. So we'll be keeping this little file, the Reader's Digest pen or pencil, just for fun. Apparently the previous owner was one of 1 million winners to get a pencil, which is fantastic. Then there's nail punches. I like those a lot. So there's the latch to release the drawer. And I emptied all my old random tools that I've restored over the last year or so. A couple of the cooler ones I put up top, and then all the wooden handle screwdrivers that, for whatever reason, I just like them. There we go. Thanks for watching.